It was also a kind of remarkable 4-year journey for New York because it started in 1986 feeling pretty good about itself. New York did. It had just kind of bounced back, recovered from the dark days of the 1970s, and the economy was booming. Skyscrapers were popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, Over the course of these 4 years, the city would kind of completely unravel over the course of these 4 years.
Do you think New York City now is in a similar pivotal moment?
In some ways, yes. I think in some ways what New York is going through right now is, and we're seeing this really during this mayoral campaign, is an answer to what happened in the 1980s. It's important to recognize that there wasn't always homelessness, that before the 1980s, there were, you had what were then known kind of derisively as bums or vagrants or winos, men living out on Skid Row out by the Bowery, but you didn't have thousands of people sleeping in the streets. That was really a product of various social and economic policies in the 1980s. I have a new debate about what New York can be. Do we want to try to redefine the city's identity? I think it has become what Mayor Bloomberg kind of famously called a luxury product. It has become a city really for the rich, for the wealthy. And I think
Yeah.
now Zohran Mamdani is questioning that identity and is raising a new kind of question that which is which is in a sense an old question, which is, can the city be more than that or something other than that?
Mr. Mahler, it's a
Yeah.
pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. So, when I initially saw the title of your book, The Gods of New York, I wasn't sure what to expect. Then I read about Ed Koch, Al Sharpton, Larry Kramer, Rudy Giuliani, and Donald Trump, among several other important names. So, are they the gods of New York in the title of your book?
Yeah. So thanks for having me, first of all. Really appreciate it. Yeah, it's a fun and interesting place to start. I mean, the title, was meant to be a little bit ironic, to be honest.
Ironic. Okay.
Yeah. The idea is, I mean, not entirely ironic. I would say half ironic. So these men are gods in the sense that they were kind of tabloid gods. So I don't think of them as Judeo-Christian gods. I think of them more like Greek gods. They were
Yeah,
they
yeah.
were petty at times and vengeful and wrathful, and New York was kind of their Mount Olympus. So, I wanted that this sense of capturing their kind of outsizedness, this kind of larger than lifeness of these characters during this moment. But I think it's sort of meant to be kind of a playful title. Like certainly I don't think of these men as gods. I mean, you might think of well, things like, the Lords of Flatbush or
Yeah.
or the Kings of New York. I mean, it's more in that spirit than in the sense of real gods.
I think I may borrow that phrase from you, Mr. Mahler. Tabloid gods. That's a great term.
Yeah, tabloid gods. Right.
So, and you explained what made them gods in the stories, their vengefulness, sometimes their pettiness.
Right.
Um, does New York now have any gods?
Not to the same degree. I mean, we are seeing now during this mayoral campaign,
Hmm.
rise of Zohran Mamdani and a figure who is achieving a kind of outsized stature in the city,
Hmm.
that we haven't seen in a while. But I would argue that it's really hard to think of any kind of current New Yorkers who had the same kind of hold over the city's imagination that these guys did back in the 80s. That and that I think is largely a product of the media. I think back then we had New York City just had a few tabloids and the New York Times. This was before the internet. This was before even really cable television, before cable
Yeah.
news.
Yeah.
And so everyone read the same few newspapers. And those newspapers could elevate a figure as they did with Donald Trump, as they did with Al Sharpton, as they did with Rudy Giuliani, as they did with Larry Kramer. They could elevate a figure and turn him into a kind of a celebrity to the degree where I think an author could get away with calling them gods.
Yeah, yeah. So in addition to their own stories and somewhat at times shenanigans, the sources of uh, getting your news and getting your tabloid were less limited than they are now. Hence, they had huge, much larger platforms back then.
Exactly. I mean, this was, this small handful of publications plus a few radio stations, local
Mhm.
radio stations, were what New York, where that was how New Yorkers got their news. And so, that was it. I mean, yeah.
Plus, Saturday Night Live was huge back then. It's still huge, but it
Sure,
was much
sure. Yeah,
larger. In
yeah,
preparation
yeah,
for this, with my
yeah.
family, we watched a couple of clips from Ed Koch on
Oh yeah.
SNL. So that was
Yeah,
fun.
yeah. Yeah, he
Um,
was he was there. Yeah.
in your book, you focus on a very, very specific period in New York City's long history, 1986 to 1990. You gave some suggestions why you chose that period, but let's get into it. Tell us more,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah. So the first and foremost, I mean, you're as a writer, you're kind of always looking for a story, for a narrative, right? Particularly I'm a narrative nonfiction writer. I'm not I don't write survey histories. I write kind of character-driven books. And so, what I needed first and foremost was a good story and a kind of a narrative that you could follow all the way through the book from beginning to end. So these 4 years were Ed Koch's last term. So the book begins with his inauguration in 1986, and it basically ends with him leaving Gracie Mansion 4 years later, a much less popular figure,
Yeah,
leaving
yeah.
behind a city that has completely unraveled. So I think I kind of saw Ed Koch as the spine of the book, and these 4 years really kind of were kind of fascinating and somewhat tragic arc for him. And then around that, I was able to sort of build other kind of story arcs for all my other characters. It was important to me as a writer to just be able to start with my characters, all of my main characters, and even some of the minor characters in one place and end up in another. That this would be a journey for them. It was also a kind of remarkable 4 year journey for New York because it started in 1986 feeling pretty good about itself. New York did. It had just kind of bounced back, recovered from the dark days of the 1970s, and the economy was booming. Skyscrapers were popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, Over the course of these 4 years, between crack, between AIDS, between all of the kind of terrible racial incidents, between the rising crime, the city would kind of completely unravel over the course of these 4 years. So the arc of the city during these 4 years was kind of fascinating and poignant too. So for me, it was just a way, a way to kind of um, focus in on stories, on people's stories and the city's story.
I see. And then many of these quote unquote gods that you narrate about still are relevant today. Mr. Trump is our president, President Trump, Giuliani's still there, Spike Lee, Al Sharpton's still there. Um,
Yeah.
which leads me to the following question. Was that a pivotal moment for New York City and also these individuals that sort of gave them a platform to rise?
Absolutely. It absolutely did. I mean, this was all of these characters were really forged in this place in this time in 1980s New York. And they were able to it was their crucible. And that was the case because of this kind of unique confluence of events. There was so much happening in the city. There was so much kind of crisis and
Mm-hmm.
drama and trauma that these characters were all able to kind of take advantage of the sort of intensity of this period of time. They were also able to take advantage of that tabloid media that was driving so much of the conversation in New York during these years. So, for someone like Donald Trump or Al Sharpton, the big lesson from these years was If you want to gain power and influence, the way you do that is by capturing the public's attention and holding it. And the
Yeah.
way you do that is you make a spectacle of yourself, either with your actions or your statements. And you do that through the tabloids, which really projected everything, amplified everything. So it was kind of a perfect moment for kind of self-styled, kind of entrepreneurial, power-hungry figures.
And they carried that way
And
into the
they
21st
did,
century.
and we see it with Trump, still today. I mean, this is his great gift as a politician, is his ability to kind of capture the public's attention, to
And hold it.
hold it exactly, and build stories. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
he does. He builds little storylines all the time. He's doing that. Yeah.
And do you think New York City now is in a similar pivotal moment?
In some ways, yes. I think in some ways what New York is going through right now is, and we're seeing this really during this mayoral campaign, is an answer to what happened in the 1980s. And what I
Oh,
mean by
really?
that,
Huh.
yes, what I mean by that is that it was in the 1980s, during this period of time I write about, that New York really reoriented itself around Wall Street, around finance, around real estate, around money, and this, what decades earlier, New York had been the America's great working class city. After World War II, New York had been a city built for the working class. That changed in the 1980s, and what has happened since then is that the gap between the city's rich and the city's poor has continued to grow. The city has become increasingly unaffordable.
Hmm.
Um, Problems like homelessness, which began in the 1980s, have only gotten worse. And New York has now reached a point, of kind of a reckoning. And I think that explains, the rise of Zohran Mamdani, who has built his entire campaign around this crisis of affordability, and is basically promising to turn New York back into a working class city, to making to he's promising to make it a city that more people can afford. And to me, that is an answer to what began in the 1980s.
So he's taking us back in time
Yeah,
uh, to a
exactly.
time before the sort of the hegemony of Wall Street and
Exactly.
humongous real estate developments. Um,
Exactly.
Homelessness and affordable housing are major themes in your book, as they are in the current mayoral race. As I read your book, I came across numerous, both sort of eye-popping stats, and I kept on saying, "Wow, really?" And
Yeah.
then just appalling stories, many of them. So at first, I selected a few, but then I realized I better just leave that to you. Are there like any specific anecdotes or stats that you'd like to share with our audience to sort of give us a glimpse of how bad it was in that 1986 to 1990 period?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a couple things I would say. I mean, the first thing, I would say is that it's important to recognize that there wasn't always homelessness. That before the 1980s, there were, you had what were then known kind of derisively as bums or vagrants or winos, men living out on Skid Row, out by the Bowery, but you didn't have thousands of people sleeping in the streets. That was really a product of various social and economic policies in the 1980s, specifically
Hmm.
the transformation of cheap housing, welfare hotels, which were the kind of housing of last resort for poor New Yorkers, into high-end apartment buildings and luxury condominiums. And it was also a product of the deinstitutionalization of the state psychiatric hospitals, so which left a lot of mentally ill people out in the streets and
Was
homeless.
the latter a Reagan policy?
It began before Reagan, but I mean, it was really, an answer to, well, honestly, movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and a
Yeah.
sense that these state psychiatric hospitals were inhumane. Also, the development of antipsychotic drugs, pharmaceuticals that people felt like should be able to manage, The behavior it would make it safer for schizophrenics and other mentally ill people to be out, to be on their own. They could manage if they were medicated. They could manage to live, without being dangerous to themselves or other people. So
Ergo, there's no longer any need for institutionalizing them,
exactly,
or not as much need.
not as much need. Correct,
Yeah,
correct.
yeah, yeah.
So that was the belief. The problem was that there was no plan for halfway houses, for places for these people to go as they kind of reintegrated into society, and there was no way to ensure that they would take their medication. And a
Huh.
lot of them didn't want to, didn't like the way the medication made them feel, and so they found themselves out in the streets unmedicated and unwell. So, which brings me to an anecdote that you asked for a specific anecdote. There's one that I was I'm particularly attached to from the book, which is the story of a woman named Joyce Brown,
Yeah, yeah,
who
yeah.
called herself Billy Boggs. She took that nickname on because she was obsessed with a local TV anchor man named Bill Boggs. So Billy Boggs, Joyce Brown, I'll call her, lived on the Upper East Side, out in front of an ice cream parlor, a Swenson's ice cream parlor. I don't know if those still even exist, but they were pretty big back then.
Yeah.
And she slept on a heating grate, and she was schizophrenic. She was unwell. But she was also a big character, and she would defecate on the street. She would, when people gave her bills, $1 bills or $5 bills, she would often just set them on fire, which seemed counterintuitive.
Wow.
So Mayor Koch one evening was riding around the city with his mental health team, kind of getting a sense of who was living out on the streets, and he had a conversation with her. And because he lived at Gracie Mansion, which was not far from the Upper East Side, not far from where Joyce Brown lived on the street, he
Hmm.
was quite aware of her. He decided at a certain point during these years that he would that this could no longer go on. That the idea that these mentally ill homeless people were sleeping in the streets, acting irrational, potentially posing a danger to themselves or other New Yorkers, that this couldn't continue. He wanted to begin forcibly institutionalizing them, hospitalizing them. Of course, there was a legal problem with this because the Supreme Court had laid down very strict rules about when someone could be hospitalized against their will.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
but Koch told his lawyers to figure out a solution, figure out a workaround, and they found a loophole that they thought would work, and Koch set aside a ward in Bellevue, in the mental hospital at Bellevue Hospital, and uh, and began a policy where he was going to begin scooping up mentally ill homeless people and hospitalizing them against their will if necessary. And the
Hmm.
very first person he wanted to pick up was Joyce Brown.
Kind of like the poster child of this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the catch was that the local branch of the ACLU, the New York Civil Liberties Union, the NYCLU, was aware of Koch's policy. He'd made no secret about it, that he was going to start doing this. And so they had gone all around the city giving out little flyers, blue flyers, to everyone who seemed like they were potentially mentally ill and homeless. And Joyce Brown had received one of these flyers. So she got picked up, was dragged into a police van, handcuffed, was furious, was brought to Bellevue, was sedated, was given, basically an enormous dose of tranquilizers. She woke up 24 hours later,
Oh,
pulled
wow.
this, pulled this little blue flyer out of her shopping bag, and called the NYCLU, and they sued the city on her behalf. And she became a big cause celeb. She was fighting. It was Joyce Brown versus Ed Koch versus the city, and her lawyers won her freedom. It took months, but she was released from Bellevue. By now, she was a full-fledged celebrity. She was on 60 Minutes. She was on the Donahue Show. She even went to Harvard Law School to deliver a lecture in a packed auditorium where she talked about being a political prisoner.
Love
So
it.
she became this just improbable celebrity, improbable kind of folk hero. Um,
Didn't President Reagan make a reference, sort of
Yes,
a
even
veiled?
even Reagan was when he was making this was in the middle of the Cold War, and Reagan was visiting Moscow, and he was being criticized, by the Russians for mistreating the poor and the homeless,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
Reagan said, "Oh, in our country, the homeless can have just fought for their freedom. This woman won the right to live on the streets." It was
Okay.
he defended it as kind of American, freedom at work. Of course,
So
the
so
Julian,
far, this is a good story. This is a great
it's a good
story.
story, but of course it ends kind of predictably and tragically because she was schizophrenic. She was not well. She was off her meds, and so she was very entertaining off her meds, and she was holding audiences rapt and a great
Yeah.
guest on public on all these talk shows, but she couldn't keep a job, and once the attention stopped, once she fell out of the headlines months later, she was back out on the streets and
That's
buying drugs and panhandling. So yeah,
that is tragic.
yeah,
Um, we were talking about, you mentioned this cheap housing that were converted into high-end, condos and luxury apartments and what have you, sort of gentrification. I have a question about a line from
mm,
page 47 of your book, and it reads as such, quote, "This created a perverse situation. The city was paying millions of dollars a year to house its homeless families in buildings that it had owned
yeah,
just
yeah,
years
yeah,
earlier." So,
yeah,
what's the story here? Is this like
yeah,
a
yeah,
cautionary tale of private
yeah,
public, I don't know,
yeah.
partnership gone
It
wrong?
is. It is. Yeah. So the city had been in a situation where, it owned lots of during the 70s when the economy really bottomed out in New York, the city took possession of a lot of buildings where landlords had stopped paying the rent. They that residents had stopped paying rent. The landlords had to couldn't pay their taxes. The city had taken possession of the building. And also the city just owned a lot of real estate. And in the 80s, when the city was looking for ways to kind of revive, it started bringing private developers in to redevelop these buildings. And a lot of these buildings had been, where had been these welfare hotels, where really the poorest New Yorkers lived, where the rent was very cheap, usually covered by your benefits from the federal government and from the state. So private developers, started to take possession of some of these buildings, and some turned them into high-end condominiums and luxury apartments. Some just held on to them because it became profitable once the homelessness crisis started to pick up and the city had to do something with these people living on the streets. It became profitable for these landlords to start renting the space out to the city for the homeless people. So in other words, buildings that the city had owned just a handful of years earlier,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
city was now filled with homeless people, and the city was covering their expenses because it had a legal obligation to provide shelter for its homeless
That is
residents.
such a crazy
Yeah,
story. And the
yeah,
conditions in these buildings, some of them,
we're
correct me if I'm
terrible.
wrong, they were
Yeah,
called SROs or something.
SROs,
SROs, yeah.
single room occupancy. Yeah,
Single
mhm,
room occupancy were just appalling, as you just said.
yeah.
Um, is this something that New York City needs to worry about now? Public-private partnership? Is that,
Yeah. Well, so what happened in these years and in the subsequent years is the city really turned development over to the private developers,
yeah,
to
yeah.
private business people. And so one thing that Mamdani is kind of promising to do is to take some of that back, is for the city to start doing more planning and more building itself. And that is a big change. That is a big
Yeah.
shift from what's been happening now for decades here.
It goes to what you were saying. He wants to go back in time to the way it was before
Exactly.
Wall Street and humongous
Exactly.
real
Yep.
estate development.
Yep.
Um, I'm going to ask a question because I'm just curious about it, and we don't need to spend that much time on it, Mr. Mahler, and that's about rent control. I know that as I was reading your uh, book, that rent control was not a big theme in your book. It's not something that I picked up. Interesting enough, Ed Koch himself had a rent control apartment uh, in in uh, uh, in New York himself, aside from living in Gracie Mansion. But
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
wondering, was that a problem, rent control back then in New York?
Yeah, I mean, there were more rent-controlled buildings
Mm.
back then. I mean, one thing that you saw a lot of during these years, and actually Donald Trump was was part of this himself,
Oh,
was developers would buy buildings, and if they were rent-controlled, they would need to get the tenants out so that they could start charging market rate for the apartments because the rent it was the rent control applied
hmm.
to the individual tenants, but it would expire when those tenants left or if one of their children didn't take over the apartment. So what you saw during these years was a lot of landlords and real estate developers trying to drive tenants out of buildings, and they would do that and Donald Trump was guilty of doing this with some buildings that he bought on the Upper West Side, is they would stop fixing leaks, they would turn off the heat. One thing Trump did was when some of the buildings in when some of the apartments started to empty out in one of the buildings that he wanted to convert, he started putting aluminum foil up in the window so that in the windows of the empty apartments, so it looked like an abandoned building. It just made it look terrible. And so this was a common practice during these years. And some real estate developers even started fires in their buildings. I mean, or hired people to start fires. This was like a common occurrence during these years.
This is a lot of illegal activity.
A lot of illegal activity. Yeah, there were prosecutions. I mean, there was a it was a big issue.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then turn, water leaks, not fixing them, turn
Yeah.
off heat. It's like eventually families don't want to live there.
Yeah, that was how they drove families out. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Is rent control a big issue in New York now in
Yeah,
this
I mean,
race?
yeah, it is. Mamdani has talked about it quite a bit, and I think it's something that he is arguing is he wants more rent control, more rent stabilization to try to control the cost of housing. The problem is that there's a lot of economists have argued that ultimately rent control only sort of shrinks housing supply and
Yeah.
ultimately drives up housing costs. So it's not necessarily a proven successful strategy to making housing more affordable.
Yeah, they actually teach that in business schools, and I've read several books on that. Um, one of your book's themes that shocked me the most, perhaps I'm naive living, in California. I'm probably less exposed to it, Mr. Mahler. But anyway, what shocked me was racism.
Yeah,
And we're talking about late 1980s. And it had two aspects to it. One was by NYPD, and the second one was by white New Yorkers. So
got it.
I'll ask you about both of them. Um, blacks, black people were attacked or killed by NYPD. And as I was reading these passages, it sort of reminded me of the George Floyd case in which Minneapolis PD had caused his
Yeah,
death.
yeah,
Um, there and like started the Black Lives Matter
sure.
movement, and your book has a lot of these.
Yeah.
Um, are there any specific like anecdotes, numbers, stats, anything you want to share with us about NYPD and racial tensions?
Yeah, I mean, there was a this was a this first of all, the police department was almost exclusively white during these years.
Huh.
There were very few black cops.
Wow.
And
Wait,
so
but the commissioner was black.
the commissioner was black, and one of his goals, and he was pretty successful, was to bring more blacks and Hispanics into the police department, which he did have quite a bit of success at doing. But during these years, it was the police department was largely white, almost exclusively white, and a lot of cops didn't live in the city. They lived out on Long Island. So, they'd come into the job, and this wasn't their place. This wasn't their city.
Wait, wait,
Um,
wait. I'm sorry. I need to ask you.
sure. Yeah.
They didn't live in their own
They did
city?
not live in their own city. They lived
So
on
there's
Long
no sort of like community connection.
Exactly. So there was no connection to the community. They would come into these precincts, and white cops coming in from Long Island to police black neighborhoods that were struggling with a major drug epidemic with crack cocaine. This was not a good situation. Um,
Huh.
and on top of that, there was a criminal justice situation where a series of incidents. I mean, kind of most infamously, a young black art student at Pratt at an art school in Brooklyn, named Michael Stewart. Uh,
Hmm.
was arrested for spray painting graffiti on a subway, allegedly for spray painting graffiti on a subway wall, and was picked up and by the police, and less than an hour later was taken to the hospital in a coma and never recovered. And the officers who had arrested him were put on trial, and all of them were acquitted. So this young black man who
Wow.
was perfectly healthy, nothing wrong with him, was taken into police custody and then was basically dead 2 weeks later. Almost certainly from a police chokehold. Was not. No one was convicted for the crime. So
And he was an art student.
he was an art student. Yeah. So
Hmm.
on top of the Jean-Michel Basquiat, the artist, painted a very famous portrait of him after this.
Hmm.
So, on top of the fact that you had this hostility between many cops and Black New Yorkers, there was also a sense that the criminal justice system was not holding them accountable, was not
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Has this issue of hiring outside city police, has that been rectified? Is
Yeah,
New York still doing that?
New York is it's there are now laws about where cops can live. And, there is much more. The police the NYPD is very aware of this as an issue now,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I'm
yeah,
glad.
and the department is much more integrated now, as you can see walking around New York. I
Of
mean,
course. Of course.
yeah,
The second theme in your book, as I said before, was racial tensions between um, the black community and also the white community. And this was more shocking to me. One of the things that really I noted, and don't let me go too far with this if I'm misanalyzing your book, is
sure.
that
Mhm.
at times it almost, you're talking about tabloid gods. At
Yeah,
times it almost didn't matter what the facts of the case were.
yeah,
The PR, the promotional part of it was getting ahead of the real investigation. And one of them that I picked up, and you and I could have 4 podcasts on this, is the Tawana Brawley case. That it reads like a drama. You read, and then at one point, like, what? That can't be. And it starts to unravel, and it's
yeah,
almost an embarrassment. So,
yeah.
could you share a
Yeah.
little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so I mean it's a wild story because it happens in the midst of what we were just talking about, in the midst of this um uh problem with police violence toward the Black community, this sense of a failure to administer justice, but it's really a racist criminal justice system, I think it's fair to say.
Hmm.
I mean, not everyone was racist, but in the criminal justice system, but it was certainly a problem. And so in that environment, along comes Tawana Brawley, who was a young a black teenager who disappeared for 4 days and claimed that she had been abducted by a group of white men, including one guy with a badge, including one cop, and had been raped. She claimed that she'd been raped repeatedly. She turned up 4 days after her disappearance in a garbage bag, kind of covered in her own excrement,
Hmm.
with you know with KKK scrawled on her chest. Um, and so her story becomes a cause celeb as well, and a source of intense outrage in particularly in the black community. And Al Sharpton, who is then a young civil rights leader, local civil rights leader, trying to make a name for himself, seizes on this case with a couple of lawyers who he worked with, and they really begin to promote this case as a tragedy.
And by the way,
In
by reading your book, I know that by the time they get to this case, they've done this a couple of times before.
they've done this before, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they
So this is like, number three or whatever it is. Number,
exactly,
yeah, yeah.
exactly, yeah. They've done it most kind of notably during Howard Beach, which a whole other.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um,
That's a fascinating story too. Go ahead.
yeah. So they begin to sort of promote Tawana's case, and they're pushing the governor, who is Mario Cuomo, to appoint an independent prosecutor to go after this case. And
And that's because they believe the criminal justice system won't give Tawana
Exactly.
Brawley a fair chance.
They believe the local prosecutor, the local DA in this was actually outside the city, up in a little bit upstate New York in Poughkeepsie. They believe that the local DA in Poughkeepsie is not going to prosecute the case, and they have good reason to believe that. There are very few black cops, and there's not a lot of not an encouraging history of prosecution of white cops in that area.
Yeah.
And so they're pushing Cuomo to appoint a special prosecutor. Eventually, Cuomo feels like he has no choice but to do it because they're really kind of dragging his name through the mud and publicly humiliating him.
Yeah.
And so he appoints a prosecutor who happens to be the state attorney general, Robert Abrams.
Wow.
And Robert Abrams begins investigating the case, and it's becoming by now, months into this incident, it's becoming increasingly clear that, well, there's no real evidence that this abduction took place. Tawana and her mother are refusing to talk to anyone, to talk to the media, or to talk to cooperate with the grand jury. And it's beginning to look like maybe this didn't actually happen. But Sharpton, by this point, has really dug in, and he continues to kind of push this narrative. And then, once Abrams completes his investigation and the grand jury hears the case and decides that there was nothing there, that it was just a hoax, uh,
Wow.
Sharpton has gone so far down this road. It's too late for him to backtrack.
Yeah.
He continues to insist that this happened. So and the media just loved this story because it was so it was this kind of mystery for a while. Well, did it happen or didn't it happen?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
it became clear it didn't. Sharpton continued to insist that it had and continued to make a spectacle. He does this incredible thing where Tawana's mother at a certain point is subpoenaed because she refuses to testify. It seems like she's not testifying because nothing happened. But Sharpton decides that, well, she's going to avoid her answering her subpoena. She's gonna seek religious sanctuary. So he hides her out in a church in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and and of course, no one wants to go in there and arrest her. No one's going to storm this black church and arrest this
Yeah.
woman. So
Yeah.
Sharpton keeps her there for a month and turns it into a huge media spectacle. The Donahue Show comes and films an entire episode there, and for Sharpton, it's like it made him famous. I mean, really,
Yeah.
more than anything.
And at
Uh,
the end, he got away with it.
he got away with
Sharp
it.
did.
Yeah, I mean, he was after Abrams goes after him afterwards, the
Yeah.
attorney general, and and tries to prosecute him for tax fraud and other financial crimes, and he's acquitted. So yeah,
By the way, as you were telling this story, I chuckled. The story of sort of white racism in New York towards black people is no laughing matter.
yeah,
But uh, I picked on this story specifically for you to share with us, is because the level of hatred, and racism had gotten to such a threshold that even something like this could go on months and months and months without any evidence.
exactly. I mean, there was so the mistrust was so at this point was so justified that I think there was a feeling for a long time, even as there was a lack of evidence, there was a persistent feeling for a long time in the black community that this had, I mean, why should we believe you? I mean, why should we believe that the attorney general who's telling us that this didn't happen? I mean, we have so many good reasons to mistrust the criminal justice system, and then it became almost kind of a political act to just believe Tawana. And there's in fact a moment in the movie Do the Right Thing, a great where you see a little graffiti scrawled on a wall in Bed-Stuy which says Tawana told the truth. This idea that you kind of had to believe Tawana because the black community in New York had just gotten a raw deal so many
Yeah.
times.
It was
Yeah,
no longer about Tuana or her case. It was about a
exactly.
bigger
It's
picture.
about something much larger. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's take a break here. Stay with me as Mr. Mahler and I get into the perspective. Mr. Mahler, immigration is not a big topic in your book. Was that not an issue in New York City back then as it is now?
Yeah. I mean, you're right, it's not a big issue, but I do kind of um, make the point early on that this was a moment of where there had been a great surge of immigration into New York, from the Caribbean, from Asia. So this was, this happened really in the early 1980s. I mean, a wave of immigration, kind of not that dissimilar from the wave of European immigration that we saw early in the 20th century.
Oh, wow,
So
that big.
it was big, yeah.
Yeah.
And there was for the first time in 1985, New York City became a majority non-white city. So that is very much in the backdrop here is that a lot of one of the themes in the book is this kind of white rage, white anger, that is in part, I think, the product of the changing complexion of the city. You see some of the acts of violence toward Black New Yorkers you see that kind of break out in white, almost exclusively white neighborhoods,
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
white enclaves where people have kind of sought to sort of isolate themselves from the changing complexion of the
Yeah.
city.
Keep it closed, keep it tight.
Exactly. And this is
Yeah.
happening at the same time that employment opportunities are disappearing for these white New Yorkers too, because many of them are not college educated, and this
Yeah.
new Wall Street real estate economy isn't accommodating to them either. So you have people who are kind of frustrated and angry, and feel like their city's being overrun by people of color, honestly. So yeah, I don't talk a lot explicitly about immigration, but it's very much informing the attitudes
Yeah.
of a lot of white New
It's
Yorkers.
in the backdrop.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to read a passage from page 398 of your book. Quote, looking back on the last 4 years, it was clear that unceasing wave of crises had really become one crisis, a single raging bonfire that had consumed New York, melting its civic glue. This is a pretty dramatic sentence, Mr. Mahler,
Yes. Yeah.
but there are so dramatic moments. You said you're a narrative historian. I think those are historical writer. And
Yeah.
really, there's a lot of narrative of these dramatic moments in New York's history. So I get that. I get the unceasing wave of crises in that sentence that I just read.
Yeah.
The thing that I want you to explain for us, please, is what do you mean that it really became one crisis, from crises to one crisis. What was that one crisis?
Yeah, I think it was a crisis of identity for New York.
Hmm.
It was it was a sense of can this be a city where that will be that's kind of a generous place that provides opportunity for everyone. Do we, as New Yorkers, all feel invested in the future of this place? That's what I mean by that kind of melting of the civic glue. Do we feel like this is more than just a place? It's an idea that offers opportunity to everyone, that should aspire to offer opportunity for everyone, that should treat everyone equally. This sense that New York is more than just a city. It's an idea. It's an aspiration in a way. To me, the crisis was, are we just is New York, has that idea failed? Is New York no longer going to be the great sort of the place where you go to make it, the great sort of city where city that provides opportunity for everyone, that can lift up immigrants, that gives everyone a kind of a social safety net, with great public schools, with great municipal hospitals. That to me was the crisis. That it was an identity crisis, an existential crisis for New
Wow,
York.
that's huge. Do you think New York is dealing with that now?
I do. I think New York
Hmm.
is in a kind of new kind of existential crisis, and I think that crisis is, do we want to try to um, basically kind of um, have a new debate about what New York can be. Do we want to try to redefine the city's identity? I think it has become what Mayor Bloomberg kind of famously called a luxury product. It has become a city really for the rich, for the wealthy. And I think
Yeah.
now Zohran Mamdani is questioning that identity and is raising a new kind of question, that which is, which is in a sense an old question, which is, can this city be more than that, or something other than that? Can this city be a place that's hospitable to the working class, that takes care of its poor? And I think the question now is, can it be both things? Can it be a place that is now, frankly, very dependent on its richest citizens to support its tax base? Can it continue to keep those people in the city, and also make it a more hospitable place for the less fortunate?
Those are humongous issues.
Yeah.
So the mayoral election is coming up in New York City on November 4th. Um, you've shared so many lessons. Is there any one of them that you want to highlight, end with, from your book, to sort of inform citizens of New York City as they sort of make their own decision for this
Yeah. I mean, the
election?
one the one last thing I would say is that, one thing, as we've talked about. I mean, this period of time I write about was not a time that New York would want to go back to. These were crazy, tough
This,
years.
despite its gods.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. The gods weren't helping anything. But it was also a time when people were really invested in the city, in the future of the city. They were fighting over the future of New York, and it was ugly. But that's what was going on. I do think that this idea of kind of civic engagement, this idea of this concern about New York, and the future of the city, is something that I feel like, has it hasn't entirely disappeared, but there wasn't that intensity. That there is no longer that intensity of interest in New York, in politics and the future of New York. And I feel like this is a moment for people to re-engage, to think about what they want their city to look like, to recognize that that this isn't just where they live. This is a place that has a long history of doing incredible things for people and for the world, and that it's a good time to engage in the debate over what it should look like, whatever your beliefs are.
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Mahler, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me.